Good morning, everyone. I hope you're sufficiently caffeinated. A very interesting conversation to kick us off today on this second day of this conference. And we're talking about open banking. And I guess the challenge with open banking is that it's quite overwhelming. It's a little bit confusing and complicated. It's very fast moving. It's something that is rolling out in 44 jurisdictions across the world, lots of different flavors. If you speak to various different people in this room and outside in the various different showcases, I think you'll get a slightly different conversation depending on who you speak to. The consultants will say one thing, the fintechs will say something else, technology companies will say something, policymakers and regulators will say something else. And if you speak to us bankers, we just want to tell you how amazing we are and ready we are for open banking. So what we wanted to do this morning with this excellent panel is have a kind of a very simple, easy to understand conversation about a very exciting topic, which is open banking. And I'm conscious it's the first session of the day. We want to keep this light and something you guys will hopefully remember, enjoy, and take home with you. So Richie, let me start with you. Let's start with the basics. What is open banking? And I think if you can help us, let's just bring it back to the customer, us as customers, because I want to bring it back to the customer a couple of times during the session this morning.
Hi, everybody. So first of all, it is absolutely nice to be back on a stage and not be in my living room. So what I to answer your question essentially is, I think as the first session of today, I think for me personally, I see open banking. Obviously I can give the definition in terms of allows for third parties to access data from customers, especially financial data with regards to financial institutions, but for me, I kind of see it more, Gavin, in terms of the customer journey, right? So I kind of put it in the 3 C's. So in terms of costs, obviously for the consumer as well as for the end user or whatever, in terms of one's time and in terms of one's kind of costs in terms of benefit, I see it as that to improve. In terms of regards to the consistency of the service, right? So you have kind of your pre-sale, transactional, and post-sale, the account management aspect of it. I see that as well in terms of how can one be consistent in that regard, in terms of that benefit. And then in terms of the customer journey for the third part, I would say the credibility, right? The credibility in terms of the security and other aspects that would allow for somebody to understand what exactly would be open banking.
There's this kind of misconception about open banking where everyone tends to think that open banking is something that banks are doing and leading, but open banking is something that's happening to banks, right? Olivier, tell us a bit about, who's driving the open banking adoption, who's actually making it real and making it happen across the world.
Yeah, so the same as well as what Rishi mentioned, is really nice to be here physically. Yes, on open banking, I think that there are many drivers, right, behind it. If you look at regulation is moving very fast, but the idea is really to be able to bring and then the customer experience. And so, if you look at platform, I think it's very important for banking services to be available where the customer is, right? To be able to be there and support them on day-to-day life or help them achieve their long-term goals, right? So I think it's both ways, driven by the fintech, it's driven by the banks, everybody having a common interest on making that happen, I guess.
So what we wanted to do this morning is we wanted to keep it kind of easy to digest, and kind of what I've seen, and I'm going to generalize here, it's not really a hard science, but I've seen maybe 4 key, I guess, business models that banks are adopting when it comes to fintech or to open banking. And just to guide the conversation, and we're not going to read out these slides, just to visually guide the conversation, I think we can go through each one of these 4 topics and we can see where it goes, right? So I think that the first business model or the first approach is what we now know commonly as kind of open banking, right? Genesis in the UK and in Europe, we have a fintech. Sometimes we call them a TPP or a third-party provider. And essentially, that fintech provides an interesting service to a customer, and then with some form of consent, me as a customer, I give consent to my bank, and the fintech can interact with the bank in some flavor. Typically, the fintech can reach in, look at my customer information, or maybe I'm giving the fintech permission to move some money in and out of my account. And that's kind of broadly speaking, what's been happening, if you look at the UK and you look at what's happening in Europe. I think what's interesting here is we can now look back over the last couple of years, 3, 4, 5 years or so, and we can clearly see a trend, right? And the trend is that fintechs have come in, lots of fintechs have come in, and they seem to focus on one particular area and do one thing really, really, really well, and then chip away at the banks. So a fintech will work in payments, lending. We see a lot of activity in wealth, right? So Richie, we're waiting on the open banking framework or anything official to be announced here in the UAE. But when open banking comes to town, is this what we should expect? These type of trends?
Yeah, I think before I answer that question, I think it's easy for the audience to understand in terms of how the global open banking scene has been. So, there's always these talks about, is open banking revolution in MENA or UAE or wherever. But you kind of have to take it a step back in terms of what's actually the models happening globally. So, for those that have been following, hands up, does anyone know what's happening with open banking in Europe? No? Okay. Okay, one person. So essentially, you have your first kind of approach where it's very legislative driven, right? So with regards to the European Union and the UK in particular at the time, because it was part of the EU, a lot of this kind of was driven by legislation, right? With the likes of the PSD2 legislation in the EU, which by 2018 the UK and other European countries had to adapt in terms of the banks adopting open banking, right? So you see that kind of legislation-driven approach, and other regions as well, like Australia have kind of taken that approach as well. And then you see it kind of the other way around, right? Where you have the US and Singapore to an extent, where it's very much consumer and very much market-driven, right? In regards to kind of fintechs and banks collaborating together to kind of, or whatever solution, to essentially, tackle this topic of open banking in terms of the needs of the end user. And then you kind of have this hybrid model. And Olivier, when we were talking earlier, I think you were in India. I think I would probably classify India as kind of like a hybrid, where you had elements of both legislative-driven and also very much more market-driven, where you kind of have that kind of blend of both. And with regards to, finally answer your question, is what would happen in the UAE? Because at the moment, obviously, it is definitely much a topic, but we look at it from a wider Middle East and Africa point of view, right? So you see countries such as Bahrain and Saudi Arabia even that's taking more of the legislative approach, where they're starting to develop these kind of opportunities. And then in terms of the UAE, you start seeing elements I see at the moment in terms of kind of a hybrid, but let's see how it goes. Because obviously the market is driving a lot of this interest, because you guys are all watching our panel right now, right? And how many of you, hands up, have been to a panel or watched some webinar or something about open banking in the Middle East? Hands up. See, a few of you, right? So this topic obviously is very much market-driven in this region, but in terms of legislation in the UAE, you've seen it where this year, I think it was ADGM, Abu Dhabi Global Market, where they launched a kind of framework for open banking, right, for open APIs. So it's very much going to see in terms of where the UAE will fall, and Olivia, feel free to add, but it's either going to be legislative-driven, it's going to be either market-driven, or it's going to be kind of a fusion of both. And at the moment, for now, it looks like it is kind of, understanding the market, but you see kind of elements of both for now.
I think at the moment, moving on to maybe the second kind of business model, if you would call it, for open banking, and I think the bankers in the room can relate to this. Certainly me working at FAB, driving the fintech agenda, it's, there's some really interesting fintechs around the world. We find these fintechs, we bring them into the bank, and we essentially, we're kind of what we call platform banking. We're building a better bank. We're using the fintechs to create a better product, service, work with data in more interesting ways. And this is more the traditional approach. When we don't have an open banking framework, we don't have regulations or rules to say we have to work with fintechs in a particular way. We don't have the standards in place. So Olivia, I guess the question for you, as we move from potentially platform banking, which I guess traditionally, as you were saying, Richie, where we are right now, into more open banking, what would you like to see from a ZAN point of view, or maybe from a regional point of view? What would you like to see?
Okay, so I think that to be able to participate in open banking, as a bank, you need to establish yourself as a platform, right? Because you need to be able really to integrate with other players who are going to complement your offering in some aspect. As what Richie mentioned, it can be driven through the legislation or through the market. Here right now is more on the market because nothing really impedes you to do open banking if you want. You just need to, there's some regulation around data because open banking is also open data.
Of course,
In a set aspect. So as long as you respect this, as long as you make sure that you keep the confidentiality of data, you establish, you follow the security guidelines as well, I think nothing impedes you really to go and open your solution, right?
I think one of the main differences between these two kind of models is around who owns the customer relationship. So in the more traditional open banking approach, particularly using Europe and the UK as kind of the genesis, the fintechs own the customer relationship, whereas in this model here on the screen, the banks still retain the customer relationship. But moving to open banking, and us as consumers, again, bringing it back to us as customers, we need to start trusting these fintechs with our financial data, which is a big ask. There's a lot of deep, important information and insights that somebody can pull out of your financial data. And I think trust plays a huge issue. So Richie, maybe quickly, looking around the world with your kind of global experience, what areas are really nailing this trust angle? Maybe give us a quick point of view on that.
I'll be really quick. So I have a good example. So when it comes to your money as a consumer or a business, obviously then we all kind of care about everything, right? So I think a good example was in the United States with COVID, right? So the stimulus checks that Americans were getting when the pandemic hit. So there were 3 different rounds. So what was a really interesting one, so I'm actually American, by the way, so I actually got my check virtually. But what was interesting was, if anybody knows American government bureaucracy, how long do those checks take to deliver, like by, traditionally they would deliver it by mail, or they would direct deposit it, right? So then we had all the fintechs in America kind of saying, hey, we could give the money to the consumers, and it made news, it made headlines, you can Google this, where hey, we could have these services, give money to you, because people in America needed it, people globally needed this, right? It was, some people were, a lot of sectors, like tourism, even the MICE industry, right, were suffering, where actually $1,200 meant a lot to them, just to buy groceries and whatnot. So you had the likes of Curve, Chime, in the US, and other fintechs that were actually being able to provide those, the money faster than the traditional deposits. Obviously, the banks had a bit of their, obviously they have to follow certain rules and things like that, but I think in the US, you kind of started seeing a rise, so you saw searches on the likes of how do I get money faster, even the word fintech kind of accelerate because actually when it came to your money during times of getting your stimulus check, it actually finally mattered to a lot of people, at least to address the idea that there might be a faster way to get my money from the government during these times of the pandemic rather than a few months.
Yeah. So
I'm conscious of time, and Olivia, I want you to help me out with the next one.
So I think on the question about who owns the customer, I think that really depends on the activities that is performed by the fintech. If the activity is leveraging or any of the regulated activity, like such as lending, interest on deposit, some remittance or transaction, as per any central bank, the bank will be considered as being responsible for what is happening. So I think it's pretty clear. So that's why you need to ensure that the people that are onboarded into the fintech, if they go and get into this kind of activity, you really understand who they are as well, because I think if any issue happen, the regulator will go back to the bank and say, this is under your responsibility. Yes, you have let someone use your license, and you need to make sure everybody using the license is compliant.
So guys, moving on. The third kind of business model that we see, and again, this isn't a hard science, this is just some point of view to guide the conversation, but to me this is the most exciting area of open banking, this idea of service banking or banking as a service or white label banking. And I think maybe I need to change the buzzword here. I think it's becoming embedded finance seems to be where we're settling. But a couple of examples just to maybe make it easy for people to understand. Uber. Uber provides bank accounts for its drivers in the US. Uber is not a bank. It's powered by a bank called GoBank. Apple has a credit card powered by Goldman Sachs. Apple is not a bank that we know of. And there's many other really great examples of this idea of service banking. And it's a really exciting space, this idea of partnership. So Olivia, what excites you about this space?
No, I think I think you're touching the point right now, is what is the value added provided by the bank in this, right? So for example, you can look at platforms like Uber and so on. They may have bank accounts, but they're always limited on what they can offer. Right? If you are not regulated, you cannot really give loan, right? You cannot give interest on deposit. There are a lot of things you cannot do. So if you are really able to partner with this organization and provide, I always say we are not a bank, we are a platform with a banking license. So what is really we are providing, the value added we add is a banking license.
Is this the future of banking? We just get relegated to plumbing and brands just take over the 100% customer experience?
No, maybe not 100%, but a huge part of it, maybe 80%, definitely, yeah.
So watch this space. Look, the final business model, and we're not really going to go into this in detail, I think this idea of open finance, and it really just takes the idea of open banking, which is banks exposing some data, and much more financial organizations expose the data in this case. There's a lot more data going around. I think it's still quite nascent. It's still growing in parts of the world. There's some interesting stuff happening in kind of Australia and Singapore. But what I will lead this on to is the point that, you know, in the UAE, we're obviously a bit behind the curve in our open banking adoption. Richie, you mentioned, you know, Bahrain has obviously got something live. Saudi has announced something's coming next year. We're still waiting on the central bank. And obviously we can't speak on behalf of the central bank. But I do believe it's a good thing. Actually, it's an advantage to us being a little bit behind the curve because we can see and be inspired by what's happening, right?
Yeah, I mean, just really quick. I mean, you know, obviously, you know, I think a lot of the success of the UAE, you know, from an economic development point of view, has been a lot of support from the top, and you start seeing a lot of that now in terms of, you know, digital transformation. You know, the UAE being a leader of that in the Arab world. I think it was ranked 12th or 13th this year in terms of one of those indexes, and first in the Arab world. So obviously, this just plays a wider part in that. You know, from the likes of Smart Dubai Strategy 2021. UAE Vision 2021, all these national strategies, such as in Saudi as well, Saudi Vision 2030, it just all ties in well in terms of the ecosystem promoting transparency. You know, if you forget anything I said today, just remember transparency.
I guess, again, in terms of our readiness for open banking, Olivier, I mean, I think that goes to our business models. But, I mean, sitting back now and your pulse on the region and obviously your global insights as well, are we ready for open banking? You know, are we actually in a good place, or are we just kind of talking about it at conferences and not really ready for any big open banking framework to be dropped on us?
No, I think so already, because a lot of this regulation to prepare on data, API, and so on are already in place. So I think at least all the infra, everything, and what you see even, things that are happening like ID, right? Emirates ID connection online. So that can be accessed by many players, right? For onboarding, everything. So there's a fantastic stage here to be able to perform very well on open banking. It's similar to India, right? There are a lot of, with Aadhaar and so on, that have been allowing really to accelerate the open banking. So the foundation is here, so I think everything is ready. So when it starts kicking, it can go very fast.
So I just want to leave very quickly one final question. To me, the elephant in the room and often the under-talked topic is not actually around, you know, the fintech ecosystem, which is growing, not actually around our ability to adopt the fintechs and standards and APIs and open banking frameworks. It does come back to this idea of fintech mindset within the bank. I don't like to use the word culture. It's a bit of a loose, over-abused word. But if teams in the bank aren't understanding fintech and open banking and the potential of open banking and coming to events like today, if people aren't reaching for fintech, we got a problem, right? Maybe just quickly, just to wrap things up, from a ZAM point of view, I mean, you're fortunate because it's a relatively new, fast-moving organization. But how are you, making sure that your internal team and people are reaching for fintech, as we say?
So I think that when you talk about digital bank, you need to have two DNAs: the DNA of banking, which is about risk management, compliance with regulation, trust, security, etc., that you cannot compromise. But you need to bring as well the DNA of digital, which is more around customer centricity, better leverage of analytics, different kind of technology platform. So it's really what you find as well when you're bringing the fintech within your organization. You're really able to bridge the two elements, which are very important, right? You really need to get both to be successful, I guess.
Listen, guys, we're out of time. That went very fast. It's a very fast-moving, big topic. I hope we broke it down and made it somewhat easy to understand, which was the goal of this morning. I want to thank our panelists. Can you please give a round of applause for Richie Santos-Diaz and Olivier? Thanks, guys.